Okay, people, so I'm just going to keep this brief. This is like March 3rd at 5 a.m. in the morning. My sleeping habits have been off for years. Yeah. Anyway, does that look familiar, people? I'm at it again. Only this time, this is to the Premier. I got the Premier on my mind. I'm writing to the Premier right now. I'm debating whether I should write it out by hand and make it more personal that way, in terms of, you know, when you write a personal letter to somebody. The problem with that, though, is you start making mistakes, right? You know, so you have to cross out, and whereas if you type it, you know, you can edit it and make it nice and neat and make sure everything's spelled correctly. And so anyway, I did that just in the last half an hour. Now what I wrote here isn't necessarily how I'm exactly going to type it when I type it, because when I start typing it, it's a different kind of writing, because you have more freedom, right, to break it up into points. And when you speed read, you want things into points, where here, I mean, you can add in points, but so anyway, I think I am going to read this just to show you how I struggle with trying to figure out what I gotta do now in terms of, you know, I have to write a letter to the Premier. I have to write a letter to the Attorney General. I have to write a letter to the police. I have to write a letter to, it's a, what is it called? That's not it. To the it's a board. It's a complaint board. The Canadian Judicial Council about Justice Bowden, because he's a federal judge. Right? But in the meantime, this is what I wrote. Well, I'm taking notes too. Trying to break it up in my head, people. How do I explain to the people that I'm writing to in point blank form that reads fairly quickly with some new information to introduce the information that you're handing in? And then one of the key notes is Fraser Health Authority should be doing the investigation. That should be a priority of Fraser Health. It was listed in my notice of claim for them to do an investigation. Right? Not for the Attorney General to do the investigation, not for the Premier, not for the police, but for Fraser Health. It's their employees. Right? They have the right within their acts to investigate this kind of stuff. And then I'm going to remind the Premier that John is a witness under the Evidence Act in terms of what I submit. He is a witness. He can't physically speak, but he's speaking through the evidence that I'm submitting. And then I'm going to remind the Premier that when someone like me acts as the Crown, that the Crown Counsel, in terms of the Attorney General, can come in and either, one, supervise the proceedings as if it was in court, or they can take control of it and, I guess, do their own investigations. That's what the last judge wants. He wants me to take it to the cops so that they investigate. And if there's a crime in there, then Crown should be the one that presses the charges, not the civilian. Being that we're talking about criminal acts. Crown Counsel act on behalf of Mr. Duncan as his legal representative. So I'm acting as his legal representative, and I'm asking under the Evidence Act for his case to be reviewed on multiple levels, right, where it involves the Crown, because that's what Uncle John would want. And then I go on to say, I'm writing to the Premier now, okay? Whether I type this in remains to be seen, but it's true. So yeah, I will probably type this in. It sounds kind of corny, but in light of, right, that, everything's getting tossed out of court, like, why? Why am I even taking the time? Anyway, Mr. Duncan was a proud government employee for over 25 years. He used to tell me how he would clean the Premier's office with a cigarette hanging out of his mouth. He told me about how he used to vacuum the red carpet in the Legislative House of Assembly. Mr. Duncan was a very hard-working man and loved this province. It was Mr. Duncan who got me started with learning about politics, and it was him who encouraged me to not be afraid or back down from the political influences that we came across as a family or as a community activist, resulting from a foundation that both he and I founded. Mr. Duncan's last wishes have been violated through false submissions that were created under the duress of his persons and immediate family, to whom the family is still left with unanswered questions and with an uncertain future. Now you have to remember, I'm bouncing around when I'm writing these things. So in other words, I'm doing something, whatever, or sitting for a minute, and then I think of something and I start writing, right? And then I start thinking again, maybe a half an hour later, and I come in, and if you notice, I draw a line there, right? And then I start writing again, right? And then I come in a little later, and if you notice, it's a different color ink, right? Because now I'm on the third time after about a 4-hour period writing. So thoughts on this will bounce around. They're not going to be in chronological order, right? So obviously here... So obviously that first part is my introduction. I'm thinking I should be introducing Uncle John, right? So this other part here is somewhere in the body of this letter that I'm going to write. And then in reference to, because I have to explain what I'm sending him, right? So acts of fraud have and are continuing to happen. I feel like they're continuing to happen because of what's going on in the court. I wasn't even in court for a matter of 3 hours. 3 hours. I went 3 times. I went in front of a master, I went in front of a judge, and I went in front of another judge. That's 3 hours, people. I was in 3 hours of judge's time between the 3 judges, give or take a few minutes, right? And it all got thrown out, right? I'm going to be charged $20,000, $40,000, who knows how much, from Fraser Health for their time, right? And I'm having now to spend money, in terms of I have to send this stuff in the mail. So who knows how much it's going to cost to send something like that in terms of, enough information, right? Anyway. So acts of fraud have and are continuing to happen. Mr. Duncan's last wishes have been violated through false submissions that were created under the duress of his persons and immediate family, to whom the family is still left with unanswered questions and with an uncertain future. Through the punishment of innocent victims for the ill actions of Fraser Health Authority and the court, the impression left for Mr. Duncan's immediate family is one where it's a lawless society wins. The court used case law that was completely unrelated to Mr. Duncan's circumstances that in many cases casted a bad light on the plaintiff to the notice of civil claim. I, Judy Chorney, did not sexually abuse Mr. Duncan, and nor did I abuse him in any other manner. However, through FHA's convoluted legal tactics, what they did was to distract away from the criminal activity that goes on within their multiple care facilities. It allowed FHA to avoid having to answer as to why provincial legislative rules and regulations were not followed by their employees, and that casted a bad light or further suspicion towards myself. So that FHA could continue on with the deception that their duty of care to Mr. Duncan was acceptable. His care was not acceptable, people. Right? So I have to remind the people reviewing this that it was not acceptable. See, I'm having to rewrite all over again almost everything I've been saying. I just having to rewrite it to another person. FHA used to their advantage the fact that I had no legal representation in the true context of ethical and fair representative and fair representative and fair representation. I'll correct it. By way of having that person being unbiased to the situation of Mr. Duncan disappearance became Mr. Duncan disappearance. Okay, hold on. By way of having that person being unbiased to the situation of Mr. Duncan disappearing and why. Instead of taking the situation seriously, it became a game for FHA and their legal team to whomever and wherever those persons and are employed within the justice system. See, this is where typing comes in easier. Right? You can read it easier, right? Instead of taking the situation seriously, it became a game for FHA and their legal team to whomever and wherever those persons are employed within the justice system. Justice Bowden. Right? Just a game. Just as easily as FHA misled the court with convoluted case law, the court itself entertained suppositions that have harmed and maimed my family and myself even further than what had occurred. Because I'm having to do this again, people. This is how many times already? When Mr. Duncan disappeared from a FHA care facility, FHA used the fact that through the removal of Mr. Duncan from his family home, that left his immediate family in a state of being perpetually depressed, while I have been on financial ruin by the very default of being left with the household debt and with the burden of having to pay extra costs trying to take this matter to court to get justice for Mr. Duncan and for my children, grandchildren, and myself. Neither the court or Fraser Health Authority take what happened to Mr. Duncan and his immediate family seriously, but yet serious enough to penalize me financially for wasting the court's time. Mr. Duncan is a case law file to them, nothing more or less. An example, as in their words, you are bound to fail. In short, I was predetermined to be guilty of allegations further falsely accused through unrelated case law, prosecuted and found guilty, and then punished, all in the space of 3 short proceedings that lasted no more than 3 to 4 hours of court time max. So that's my introduction to the Premier. That's and then I'll write as I go about, and then I have to sit down and take that and type it out so that I can ease in that evidence.